April 17th, 2025, an article starts circulating online and it's spreading fast. The title, The Richest Cop. At first, it looked like just another expose, but this one was different. The piece accused a senior Kenya police officer, only identified as Lagat, of earning 25 times more than President Ruto, thanks to a massive bribery allegedly facilitated by top police commanders across the country. It was bold, too bold, and it struck a nerve. Within hours, reports emerged that a group of plainclothes officers believed to be acting on orders had stormed the offices of Standard Media Group, not for an interview, for an interrogation. They demanded answers. Who published the article? Who was behind the leak? But here's the twist. The Standard denies everything. They say the article did come from them. They never published it, never approved it. In fact, the story wasn't even on their servers. So now it gets strange. After a few tense hours of back and forth, the officers leave the premises. No arrests, no statements, just silence. They drive off in a Probox license plate KDD055Z. But internet sleuths weren't done. Someone runs that number through the NTSA public portal. And what comes up? A completely different vehicle. The number plate belongs to a black Subaru Forester, not a Probox. So now you've got fake plates, a fake article, and a swarm of real police agents sent to shut it down. What exactly were they trying to hide? A few days pass. The dust hasn't even settled from the last scandal, and then boom, another article drops. And this one, it's even more explosive. Still branded under the Standard. Even though they continue to deny any involvement, the headline reads, The Mafia Cop. This wasn't just targeting a senior officer, it was gunning straight for the top. The article pointed fingers directly at the Deputy Inspector General Eliud Kiplangat, alleging that he was running a well-organized criminal syndicate within the police force. The claims that this operation was pulling in over 100 million shillings every month through corruption, protection, rackets, and systemic extortion. It was no longer just gossip. This was a direct shot at the top levels of Kenya Police Command. And this time, someone powerful wasn't going to let it slide. But they didn't go after the author. They didn't go after the source. They went after the people sharing it. That's where Albert Ojwang comes in, a former teacher, a father, and an outspoken activist on X. Albert had built a modest following of over 8,000 people. He was known for calling out corruption and speaking truth to power. By the time this article surfaced, Albert was no longer in vogue. He had recently quit his teaching job, frustrated by low pay and broken promises, and had moved back to his father's rural home in Homa Bay. It should have been a time to reset, to heal, but instead, he shared the Mafia Cop article. One repost, one retweet, that's all it took. And just like that, Albert Ojwang made himself a target. Because in a country where power often operates in the shadows, sharing the wrong story can get you silenced. And that's exactly what happened next. Albert's transfer to Central Police Station will mark the beginning of a dark and twisted spiral. A story no longer about social media or free speech, but now about deception, cover-ups, and ultimately death. Because just 24 hours after his sudden relocation from Homa Bay, his father, Meshach Ojwang, who had traveled the long journey to Nairobi in search of answers, was met with the kind of news no parent should ever hear. He was told that his son was dead. And not just dead, that Albert had taken his own life. According to the police, Albert had, in the dead of night, suddenly started banging his head against the wall of his cell repeatedly until he sustained critical injuries. No warning signs, no intervention, just a violent, solitary end inside a government facility. The official statement came swiftly. Police spokesperson Moshiri Nyaga addressed the media with calm detachment, stating that the deceased had been lawfully arrested and, yes, lawfully transferred. He added that while in custody, Albert had reportedly suffered multiple head injuries after repeatedly hitting his head on the wall, and despite efforts to rush him to Mbagathi Hospital, he was pronounced dead on arrival. on paper, it sounded like an open and shut case. A suspect arrested, taken into custody, a tragic mental breakdown, and an unfortunate suicide. But outside the four walls of that police press briefing, no one was buying it. Because when Albert Ojwang's body was viewed by family and close associates, it told a different story. There were injuries on the back of his head. There were deep bruises and swelling on his face. And these weren't the kind of wounds consistent with self-harm against a wall. They looked like signs of blunt force trauma, signs of a beating. The kind that suggested not self-inflicted pain, but violence delivered by someone else. And that's when the questions began to pile up. If Albert had been under custody in a secure police cell, how was he able to injure himself so badly without anyone intervening? Why was he moved 400 kilometers away, far from his home jurisdiction, and held in a place where his family and legal counsel couldn't reach him? And perhaps most haunting of all, was Albert Ojwang murdered? Because to those who knew him, those who followed his activism, and those who saw the bruises on his lifeless body, the story didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a cover-up. At this point, nothing was adding up. Not the timeline, not the condition of the body, and definitely not the official police statement. Albert Ojwang had reportedly been arrested on Friday afternoon. Yet, according to police records, he was only officially booked 32 hours later on Sunday, and by that time, he was no longer alive. That gap, those missing hours, became the center of everything. Because how do you hold a man in custody for a day and a half without any record, and then suddenly log him in as a corpse? The public wasn't buying it, and this time they weren't staying quiet. You see, the rising cases of extrajudicial killings, mysterious disappearances, public kidnappings in broad daylight, and reckless online remarks by top regime officials, Kenya had already become a powder keg of suspicion and rage, and Albert's case lifted the fuse. The outrage was instant. Social media platforms, especially X, formerly Twitter, erupted with anger, grief, and a growing sense of fear that no one was safe, not even a teacher from Homa Bay who had simply shared an article. And then came the tweet that turned outrage into fury. Senator Karen Nyamu, already known for her controversial takes, posted a sarcastic jab that would become infamous. Maybe Albert Ojwang kidnapped himself. That one line broke the internet. It didn't just offend, it infuriated, because here was a man who lost his life under suspicious circumstances, and a sitting senator was mocking the situation as if it were a joke. The public demanded answers, and under mounting pressure, it became clear that an autopsy had to be done. Not one controlled by the same officers who issued the vague suicide story, but by a professional, a medical expert, someone who could offer clarity amid the lies. That brings us to Johansen Odor. If you follow high-profile deaths in Kenya, you've heard this name before. Dr. Johnson Odor, chief government pathologist. The man always at the center of national tragedy, from controversial police shootings to political assassinations. He is the government's go-to medical examiner. But here's the thing, his name comes with baggage. He is no stranger to controversy, and many Kenyans still remember the allegation trying him to the cover-up of Professor George Saitoti's death, a case shrouded in as much secrecy as it is in blood. Over the years, critics have noticed a pattern. His autopsy reports almost always match the official government narrative. Coincidence or convenience? This time, the pressure was too much. Facing immense backlash, the accusation of bias, Dr. Odor was forced to rescue himself from handling Albert Ojwang's postmortem, because the public no longer trusted him to speak the truth. And at this point, truth was the only thing people were demanding. When the dust settled and pressure from all sides became too loud to ignore, a decision was finally made. 5 independent pathologists will conduct the postmortem on the body of Albert Ojwang. These weren't just random doctors. They represented every major party involved in the case: the family, the government, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, IPOA, and various human rights organizations. And yet, no one, not even the most cynical observers, was fully prepared for what the findings would reveal, because what they found didn't point to suicide, it pointed to torture. The autopsy exposed a chilling catalogue of injuries: severe trauma to the head, signs of neck compression, and multiple soft tissue injuries scattered across his back, face, limbs. Nearly every region of the body bore some mark of violence, and the conclusion was unanimous. The injuries were consistent with physical assault. No one of the 5 doctors found any medical basis to support the police claims that Albert had repeatedly hit his head against the wall. The theory of self-harm was officially ruled out. That moment changed everything, because what the autopsy confirmed wasn't just that Albert was killed, it confirmed that he had been murdered while in state custody. And Kenyans, they were done staying quiet. This wasn't just about Albert anymore. He had become a symbol, because just days before his death, in a completely separate incident, an innocent bystander in Nakuru's London area was shot and killed during a reckless police operation. Another name, another life lost, another excuse from law enforcement that no longer held weight. But this time, something snapped. The streets of Nakuru erupted, not with peaceful chants, but with fury. These weren't demonstrations, they were warnings. In one now infamous video, a man was captured charging at armed officers with a panga, his rage outpacing his fear, a raw embodiment of just how broken public trust had become. Because Kenyans were tired of staged narratives, tired of bodies piling up, tired of waiting for justice that never came. The autopsy results unleashed a digital explosion, a wave of outrage that surged through social media like wildfire. Tweets came in by the thousands. One in particular captured the national mood perfectly. DIG Langat should have been arrested by now. An investigation should have been opened immediately, and the officers who lied about Albert hitting his head should be charged with perjury. We are not stupid. The message was clear. Kenyans were no longer interested in patience, they wanted consequences, and so the streets began to fill again. Only this time, it wasn't just Nakuru, it was Homa Bay, Kisumu, Thika, Nairobi. Angry crowds demanding answers, waving placards with Albert's face, facing tear gas and batons, but refusing to back down. Albert Ojwang was no longer just a name, he had a movement. As speculation swirled and anger continued to rise, a new information quietly surfaced, not through official briefings or police statements, but through credible leaks to the Star newspaper. And what those leaks described wasn't just negligence or brutality. It was a coordinated torture and cover-up operation. According to the sources, Albert Ojwang, the teacher, father, and activist, had died in a police cell. He had died much earlier in the shadows of Karura Forest. Yes, Karura Forest, one of Nairobi's most well-known green spaces, a place associated with morning jogs, school trips, and weekend picnics, was now the alleged crime scene of a state-sponsored beating. The report was chilling. Albert, who had originally been booked at Central Police Station in seemingly stable condition, had allegedly been removed under the cover of darkness, driven toward Kiambu Road and taken to a remote forest location where a small group of police officers, including a senior figure and his personal driver, carried out a brutal beating. He was allegedly handcuffed, defenseless, and subjected to a horrifying ordeal, beaten, kicked, punched, left bleeding and broken until his body slipped into a coma. And then, as if to arrest the evidence, he was driven back unconscious to Central Police Station, arriving just after 1 a.m., limp, battered, and barely alive. Sources inside the station described the scene with disturbing clarity. Several officers reportedly objected. They didn't want to take responsibility for a man who was clearly on the verge of death. They knew what it looked like, but then came the order from above. And just like that, protocol, morality, and human dignity were tossed aside. Albert was placed into a solitary cell, still unconscious, still untreated, and left there to die. At 3:39 a.m., he was declared dead, officially recorded under OB number 9 06/2025. Another line in a ledger, another statistic. But this time, the whispers wouldn't stay whispers for long, because as the story grew louder, the pressure moved from the streets to the highest chambers of power. Interior Cabinet Secretary Kipchumba Murkomen and DCI boss Mohammed Amin were summoned by the Senate for questioning, a grilling session that promised to finally force answers out of the top brass. It was no longer just activists and families crying out for justice. Parliament had entered the chat, because what had started as a mysterious death of a vocal ex-users had now spiraled into a national scandal, one that threatened to expose the rot inside Kenya's law enforcement system, the abuse of power by senior officers and the silence that had allowed it to fester. So when Interior CS Murkomen and DCI boss Amin finally sat before the Senate, all eyes were on them. And what they said, well, it only made things worse.
It seems that police stations have become the new crime scene. And I, as I proceed, want to call for the IG and his deputy, who have had far too many extrajudicial killings under their belt in just 1 year, fired with immediate effect. Mr. Speaker, because there are too many rights that have been violated through the death and the killing of Albert, 26, 28, and 29, and other articles of the Constitution. Why was Albert Ojwang arrested without a warrant or a clear explanation of the charges contrary to Article 49? Why was he transferred over 350 kilometers from Homa Bay to Nairobi instead of being processed locally? On what basis was he even detained in Nairobi? Why was his safety not guaranteed while in police custody as mandated by Section 59 of the National Police Service Act? And if the allegations of corruption that he made were worth killing him, then why isn't this precisely what we're investigating? Because only a hit dog hollers. DCI should not be seen anywhere near this investigation, Speaker. A judgment by Justice Mugambi on the 9th of May 2025 clarified that only IPOA has the mandate to investigate deaths and injuries caused by police officers who are on duty or occur in custody. Not DCI, not any other department of the police. Also, the Security Services Laws Amendment was introduced in Parliament to expand IPOA's oversight powers and give it more teeth, not just recommendations, but actually allow them to make arrests. But the National Assembly has blocked this bill. We know that. They say that it doesn't concern counties, thereby stalling its legislative process in this Senate, and therefore obstructing real justice. We have to fight as a Senate to bring that bill. Dead people don't tell tales, Speaker, but the collective voice of Kenyans demands that this tale be told and justice be served immediately. I thank you.
CS Murkomen, the National Security Council, where you sit, is charged with promoting and guaranteeing security of the country. And you have the audacity to come and face the Parliament of Kenya and tell Kenyans that you don't see, you don't know. CS Murkomen, please, for the respect of this young man, you are yet to grow a child up to the age of 31. Can you immediately resign? You are not fit to be in that docket.
It's in what can only be described as a desperate attempt to control the narrative. They assure the Senate that Albert Ojwang had been in perfect health condition while in custody. According to them, he had been treated well, even offered refreshments in his cell, and there was no foul play. They stuck to that line, unshaken, unflinching. But there was a huge problem with that version of events. CCTV footage and hospital records obtained by Citizen TV would paint an entirely different picture. And this time, there were receipts, because the evidence showed that by that time, Albert Ojwang was taken to Bangathi Hospital. He wasn't in critical condition, he was already dead. And the trial of that night's event is haunting. At exactly 1:35 a.m., a police van pulled into Bangathi Hospital emergency bay. Inside were 3 officers and a body lying motionless in the back of the vehicle. That body was Albert Ojwang. The 2 officers stepped out and approached the hospital doors, but just before entering, one of them received a phone call. He paused, he turned back, and the others followed him outside. 3 whole minutes passed as the officer based on the phone call. Not one of them checked on Albert during that time. Let that sink in. This was a man they claimed they were rushing to save. But instead of medics, instead of urgency, Albert Ojwang's body sat untouched in the back of the van while his escorts appeared to be waiting for instructions. And then, after the call ended, they finally entered the hospital. It took another 24 minutes before anyone at the hospital actually attended to Albert, and by that time, medics approached him. He had been dead for hours, dead. On arrival, no vitals, no pulse, no effort made to check on him until it was too late. And what happened next was even more chilling. Rather than leaving the body with hospital staff for formal documentation or care, the police officers, after being informed that Albert was deceased, loaded his corpse back into the van and returned it to Central Police Station. Yes, they brought a dead body back to the very station where they had just claimed he was fine and well taken care of. So now, the Senate had a choice. Believe the testimony of high-ranking officials or believe the cold, time-stamped evidence captured on security cameras and hospital logs. The cracks in the state story had become a crater, and what poured out wasn't just incompetence. It looked a lot like premeditated murder followed by a deliberate cover-up. And with every new leak, every new footage frame, and every contradiction in the state's story, the pressure was building. You see, at this point, it wasn't just brutality, it was just incompetence. It was perjury. Senior government officials had just lied under oath, and in Kenya, that's a crime, perjury, punishable by a minimum of 7 years in prison if convicted. But instead of coming clean or launching a transparent investigation, the state made yet another desperate move. They arrested 3 suspects, allegedly fellow inmates, and claimed Albert Ojwang was beaten to death by other prisoners, a convenient narrative. But the public wasn't buying it, even if it were true, even if fellow inmates had assaulted him. Where were the officers? Why did no one intervene? And more importantly, why did the government lie about it in the first place? They had said he hit his head on the wall. They had said he was fine. They had said they gave him refreshments. And now it was rogue inmates. Their contradictions were collapsing on themselves. One of the officers at the center of it, OCS Alam, the man who signed off on the fake statement, was arrested and brought to court. He denied all the charges. Another suspect, Mukwana, admitted that he was instructed to let inmates rough him up a little bit. But again, was this just another scripted scapegoat maneuver? Another attempt to steer the blame away from senior government officials and throw the public a few points while the kings and queens stayed protected? Because even if this version had a grain of truth, it begged even more disturbing questions. Why wasn't Albert protected in custody? Why was the first official statement a fabricated suicide? Why wasn't there a thorough investigation before the media and Senate exposed the truth? And more hauntingly, how many other cases like this have never seen the light of day? Because at the end of the day, it's just to them, and we are playing checkers. Take this for example. Governor Sakaja suddenly offered a county job to Albert's wife and free education to his son, Miles. An noble gesture on paper, but people couldn't help asking, why did Albert have to die for his family to be acknowledged? In life, he was a jobless teacher, barely making ends meet. Now, in death, opportunities magically appear. Even the president offered 2 million Kenya shillings to Albert's father, who in turn released a public statement saying the president loved Albert like his own son. But if that were true, if Albert was truly like a son, why is there a cover-up? Why did he die in police custody under mysterious circumstances? And while the family seems willing to settle for a few pennies on the dollar, Kenyans aren't. They've seen this pattern before, and this time they've had enough. What followed was a new wave of nationwide protest, this time even louder, even more furious. Then came the announcement. DIG Eliud Langat had stepped aside pending investigations, but Kenyans know what that means. Stepping aside is just a smokescreen. It's often code for let the storm pass, then quietly return when no one's looking. But this time, people were looking. Even former Chief Justice David Maraga weighed in, saying plainly, these people should be arrested and prosecuted. No one is above the law. And with that, the message was clear. Justice isn't optional. It isn't negotiable. And no matter how high you sit in power, you don't get to murder someone and walk away. In the end, Albert Ojwang's death wasn't just a tragedy. It became a symbol, a reminder that in this country, telling the truth online can get you killed, and that sometimes the people who want to protect you are the ones pulling the trigger. The government's attempt to clean up the mess with harsh money, job offers, and hollow condolences didn't fool anyone, because the truth doesn't die in the cell with the victim. It leaks from morgues, from autopsy tables, from brave whistleblowers, and from citizens who refuse to stay silent. Albert's story hit a nerve because his story could have been anybody else. A teacher, a father, an activist dragged into the dark for retweeting a post and never came back alive. And while the DIG stepping aside might sound like accountability, it's not. It's a delay tactic, a distraction, a hope that the outrage will fade and people will move on. But what they don't realize is this time people aren't moving on. Because if Albert Ojwang can die for sharing a link, who's next? And if this case is swept under the rug like so many before it, what does that say about the country we're living in? As one Kenya put it online, if the truth gets you killed, then silence is a prison. We either speak now or we live in fear forever. And that's where things stand for now, because justice hasn't been served, and as long as it hasn't, I've been Micah Hindi, and this isn't over. Nairobi Insight.